I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and close to where I needed to be for a short work trip. It was a shared apartment in the city, just a single room with a bed, a small desk, and access to a shared kitchen and bathroom. The listing said one other guest might be staying there, and that the host lived off-site. I didn't think much of it. I'd stayed in plenty of shared Airbnbs before. It was in an older building downtown, the kind with long hallways, heavy doors, and walls that carried sound easily. When I arrived, the front entrance was a little worn down. The paint on the walls was chipped, the stairs creaked, and the air inside smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The host had sent me a code to get in. The lock clicked open, and when I stepped into the apartment, it was quiet. The lights were dim, one of the bulbs flickering slightly in the kitchen. There was a faint smell of cleaning spray mixed with something musty. The place was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living area with an old couch and a coffee table covered in small scratches. My room was at the end of the hallway. Inside, it was simple but clean. A single bed pushed against the wall, a lamp on a small nightstand, a dresser, and a thin curtain that barely covered the window. I set my bag down, opened the window a bit to get some air, and looked around for any sign of another guest. The other room's door was closed. I assumed someone was staying there, but the whole place felt still, like no one had been inside for a while. I unpacked a few things, made myself some food, and sat at the small desk to finish some work on my laptop. Outside, I could hear faint traffic sounds. Car horns, people talking, a siren in the distance. It felt oddly peaceful, even though the building itself seemed a little neglected. Around 11 p.m., I turned off the lights and lay down. The bed was firm, the air warm and dry. I remember hearing faint noises from the street, but nothing unusual. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was completely dark, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I didn't move for a few seconds, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it slow, steady breathing. It wasn't mine. It was close, too close. At first, I thought maybe the other guest had come in late and was sleeping in the next room. But the sound wasn't coming from across the wall. It was coming from right next to my bed. Deep, rhythmic, quiet, but definitely human. My heart started pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I stayed still, listening. The breathing was steady, low, like someone trying not to be heard. I reached slowly toward my phone on the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and I swept it across the room. The dresser, the corner, the curtain, all normal. I lowered the light a little toward the floor. That's when I saw him. A man was lying flat under the bed. His face turned toward me, his eyes wide open. He wasn't asleep. He was staring straight at me. His skin looked pale, his hair matted, his clothes dirty and torn. His eyes didn't blink when the light hit him. He just looked up at me, frozen, like an animal caught in headlights. For a moment, I couldn't move. My whole body went numb, couldn't even breathe. Then instinct kicked in. I scrambled backward, knocking over the lamp, and shouted without thinking. The man jerked forward, sliding out from under the bed so fast I barely saw him move. He jumped up, ran to the door, and disappeared down the hallway before I could even react. The sound of his bare feet against the floorboards echoed through the apartment, and then there was silence again. I stood there shaking, staring at the empty space under the bed where he'd been. The blanket was half hanging off, the floor covered in dust and small bits of trash. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold my phone. I turned on every light in the room, then in the hallway, and checked the door. It was unlocked. He must have come in through it, or maybe from somewhere else. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall, the lights on, listening for any sound. I could still smell the dirt from where he'd been lying, mixed with sweat and something faintly sour, like old food. Every small creak in the building made me jump. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things fast. My hands were still shaking when I zipped my bag. I checked under the bed again before I left. There was a small blanket tucked under the corner, a crushed plastic bottle, and a few crumbs. It looked like someone had been sleeping there more than once. I left the apartment and stood outside for a long time, trying to calm down. The city around me was just starting to wake up. Cars honking, people heading to work, the normal noise of morning. It felt unreal after what had happened. When I finally got through to the Airbnb host, they told me no one else was booked in the other room that week. I called the police next, and they came to check the place. I waited downstairs, still shaking, while they searched the apartment. Later, one of the officers told me what they found. The man had broken in through the fire escape window in the back. There was a loose latch on it, and he'd been using it to get inside when no one was around. He'd apparently been sleeping under guests' beds for days at a time, sneaking in and out without being noticed. The host didn't even know. There were signs he'd done it before, old food wrappers and a worn blanket stuffed behind a dresser. They said he was a homeless man who had been living in the area for months, slipping into empty apartments to sleep at night. He wasn't violent, just desperate. Still, the thought of him lying under me while I slept, listening to my breathing, waiting for me to fall deeper into sleep, it made my skin crawl. I never went back for the refund or my last night's stay. I left the city that afternoon, checked into a small hotel near the highway, and didn't sleep much there either. For weeks after, I kept checking under my bed before going to sleep, even at home. Sometimes I still do it without thinking. It's a habit now, one I can't shake. What still gets to me isn't just that he was under the bed. It's how quiet he was, how long he might have been there before I even noticed. Maybe he was already there when I arrived. Maybe he'd watched me unpack, eat, work, all while lying there just a few feet away, hidden by the shadows beneath the frame. The idea that someone could be that close, that unseen, in a place you're supposed to feel safe changes how you see everything. Since then, I've stopped staying in shared Airbnbs altogether. I only book private places now, and I check every lock, every corner, every window latch before I sleep. That night taught me something I can't unlearn. That sometimes you're not alone, even when everything around you looks perfectly normal. Sometimes the danger isn't outside the door. It's already in the room with you, waiting quietly, just out of sight. It was early spring when my friend and I booked that off-grid Airbnb cabin. We were both in college, drained from midterms, and we wanted somewhere quiet to study and reset for a week. Everything about the listing made it sound peaceful. Tucked at the edge of a forest, no cell service, no neighbors for miles, just a small wooden cabin with solar power and a wood stove. It was cheap too, cheaper than most places, probably because it was so isolated. That didn't bother us. We figured a little solitude would help us focus. The drive out there was long. The last half hour was down a narrow dirt road that wound through thick woods. There were no signs, no houses, no lights. The GPS had cut out about 10 minutes before we got there, but we followed the directions the host had sent. When the cabin finally came into view, it was just as described, small, weathered, sitting on a patch of grass surrounded by trees. There was a small porch with 2 chairs, a fire pit a few feet away, and an old shed off to the side that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The air felt still. No traffic, no wind, just quiet. We unloaded our bags, set up our laptops and notebooks, and for a while, it really did feel like the perfect spot. There was a small stream nearby where we could hear running water when it was quiet enough. The place smelled of pine and damp wood. The first night started calm. We cooked some pasta on the small gas stove, sat on the porch until it got dark, then went inside to read. The only light was from the small solar lamp and a lantern. Around midnight, I stepped outside for a bit to use the bathroom since there was no running water inside, and I noticed how pitch black it got out there. The forest seemed to swallow any bit of light from the cabin. I couldn't even see my hand unless I pointed the flashlight at it. When I went back in, I noticed something odd near the steps. Faint muddy marks that looked like footprints. They weren't clear enough to tell much, just smudges of mud, but it looked like someone had walked around that area. I brushed it off as animals. The ground was soft from rain earlier that day, so it could have been anything. Maybe deer or raccoons. The next morning, though, when we stepped outside, there were more footprints. This time they were clearer. Human, barefoot or maybe in thin shoes. They circled the cabin in a wide loop, messy and uneven, like someone pacing in circles. We both looked at them for a while, uneasy but not panicked. The host had said in the listing that hikers sometimes pass through the area, so maybe it was that. We didn't have cell service to message the owner anyway, so we decided not to overthink it. The second night was colder. The wind had picked up and the cabin creaked a little, especially the boards near the window. I stayed up late reading with my headlamp, and around 1 a.m, I thought I heard something faint outside, a slow crunching in the dirt. I froze for a few seconds, thinking maybe it was my imagination. It stopped after a minute and I didn't mention it. The next morning, we saw the footprints again. This time, the circles were tighter. They weren't wide loops anymore. Whoever or whatever it was had walked closer to the walls. There were spots where the dirt was kicked up more, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. It made my stomach twist. We talked about packing up, but we convinced ourselves again that it was probably just some hiker or a local wandering through. The nearest town was at least 30 minutes away, though, and the road leading in was rough. It didn't make much sense, but it was easier to ignore the feeling. That day, we didn't do much studying. We spent most of it sitting outside, just trying to keep our minds busy. The forest around us looked calm. Tall trees, the stream flowing quietly. But every so often, I thought I saw something at the edge of the trees. A bit of movement, maybe. The sun reflecting off something metallic. Every time I looked, it was gone. That night, the noises were louder. Twigs snapping, steps in the dirt, faint movement that made the floorboards vibrate just slightly. I could feel my chest tighten every time the sound came closer. There was a moment around 3 a.m. when something brushed against the wall near the window, soft but heavy enough to make the wood creak. I barely slept after that. When the sun came up, the ground outside was worse. The footprints were now right up against the walls, circling tightly. There were smudges on the lower part of the wood like someone's dirty hands had pressed against it. We didn't say anything. We just stood there, staring at the marks. Felt like the air itself had changed, heavier somehow. We decided to stay one last night and leave in the morning. We had already paid for the week, but at that point, neither of us cared about the money. I remember trying to distract myself by reading, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the window, where the light was fading. Every small sound made me jump. The stove clicking, the wind shifting the trees. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. It was quiet, too quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then came the sound, breathing. Slow, heavy, uneven breathing, coming from outside, right near the window. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling. The breathing went on for what felt like forever, low and strained, like someone standing still and listening. The wall creaked once, and the breathing grew louder, like whoever it was had leaned closer. I didn't dare look. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. I could smell something faint. Cigarette smoke, mixed with sweat and dirt. After a few minutes, it stopped. Just like that. Silence again, but the kind that makes your ears ring. I stayed frozen for a long time, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing came after that. At dawn, we packed everything as fast as we could. The air outside was cold, damp with dew. When I stepped out, I looked toward the window where I'd heard the breathing, and that's when I saw it. A small pile of cigarette butts, food wrappers, and an old pocket knife lying just outside the wall, half buried in the dirt. The footprints were everywhere around that side, overlapping each other, messy and deep, like someone had been standing there night after night. There was no mistaking it anymore. Someone had been out there watching us, not just passing by, but staying, circling the cabin, waiting. We threw everything into the car and didn't even lock the door behind us. The drive back down that dirt road felt endless. Every curve of the trees looked the same. Every shadow felt like it was moving. When we finally reached the paved road and got cell service again, I checked the Airbnb listing. The host's profile was gone, completely deleted. We reported what happened to Airbnb later, sent photos of the footprints and the things we found, but they said they couldn't do much without proof of who it was. The listing disappeared a few days later. Even now, I still think about those nights, about how quiet the breathing was, how close it sounded. Whoever was out there didn't just stumble on the cabin by chance. They'd been there before, probably watching from the woods, waiting for someone to stay. I still don't know if they were planning to break in or just liked watching, but every time I think about it, I remember that smell of smoke through the window, faint and human, close enough to touch. I haven't stayed in another remote Airbnb since. Every cabin photo I see online now, every picture of a window looking out into the woods, makes me remember that feeling. The sense that something was just beyond the glass, watching, circling closer each night until we left. It was late December when my girlfriend and I booked the Airbnb cabin. We wanted to spend a quiet weekend away from the noise of the city. Just snow, woods, and peace. The listing described it as a rustic retreat in the hills, with no neighbors for a mile, a wood-burning stove, and views of pine trees in every direction. It looked cozy in the pictures. The price was decent too, probably because it was off-season and the roads were half buried in snow that time of year. The drive there was long. The road wound through forested hills, and the snow kept getting thicker the higher we went. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow gravel driveway, partly covered in ice, surrounded by dense trees that blocked most of the sunlight. It looked like something out of a postcard, small, wooden, smoke rising from the chimney when we lit the stove, the air crisp and still. Inside, it was simple but warm. There was a living room with a couch and a small TV, a kitchen tucked into the corner, and a single bedroom with a thick quilt on the bed. The walls were lined with old wood panels that smelled faintly of pine. There was a small attic hatch above the living room couch, just a square cut into the ceiling with a thin rope hanging from it. I remember noticing it right away because it looked old and slightly crooked, but I didn't think much of it. The first night was peaceful. We made soup, played cards, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. The snow outside muffled every sound. It felt like we were completely alone, miles from anyone else. Around midnight, I went outside for a moment to throw out the trash, and the cold air hit me hard. That kind of cold that makes everything feel sharp and silent. The stars were bright, the snow reflecting the light from the moon. When I came back in, I noticed something odd. The attic hatch above the couch was slightly open. Not much, just enough to see a dark gap between the cover and the ceiling. I stood under it for a moment, staring. The rope was swinging slightly, maybe from the draft when I opened the door. I figured the change in pressure or wind must have pushed it up a little. It was an old building after all, probably not perfectly sealed. I got a chair, pushed it closed, and thought nothing more of it. The next morning, we woke up to the sound of creaking wood above us. I figured it was just the roof adjusting in the cold. When I walked into the living room, though, the attic hatch was open again, wider this time. There were crumbs on the floor under it and a plastic bottle cap lying near the couch. The crumbs looked fresh, like someone had been eating bread or chips and dropped them. I stood there for a while just looking at the spot. It didn't make sense. The hatch wasn't light enough to open on its own, and the rope hung still, not moving at all. I looked around the cabin for any sign of animals. No droppings, no scratching sounds, nothing. The snow outside was untouched too. No footprints except ours. I tried not to let it bother me, but something about it felt wrong. There was a quietness to the cabin that morning that felt different, heavier somehow. My girlfriend looked uneasy too, though neither of us said it out loud. We cleaned up the crumbs, closed the hatch again, and spent most of the day reading and keeping the fire going. By nightfall, the temperature dropped sharply. The windows frosted over, and the air inside grew dry. Around dinner, we heard a dull thump from above, like something shifting in the attic. We froze, both of us looking up at the ceiling. It stopped after a few seconds. I tried to convince myself it was just snow sliding off the roof. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that open hatch. I ended up moving the couch a little farther from it, just so I wouldn't have to sit directly underneath. That night, when we went to bed, I kept hearing faint creaks, like footsteps, spaced apart just enough to sound deliberate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was the house settling. The next morning, the hatch was open again, this time even wider than before. There were more crumbs on the floor, and this time a corner of a food wrapper near the rug. My stomach sank when I saw it. Someone had been up there. I knew it then. The opening was too high for any animal, and the things on the floor were too specific. Food bits, wrappers, small signs of human activity. I grabbed my phone, stepped outside where the signal was weak but usable, and sent a message to the host. I told her what we'd seen and asked if she'd been there recently. Took a while for her to respond. When she did, her reply made my stomach twist. She said that her brother sometimes stayed in the attic without telling guests when he needed a place to crash. She said he was harmless and probably hadn't realized we were there that weekend. I just stood there staring at the message for a long time, trying to process it. Someone had been living up there, sleeping above us, eating in the attic while we sat below, completely unaware. We didn't even bother packing neatly. We just grabbed everything, stuffed it into our bags, and left as fast as we could. When I went back inside one last time to grab my phone charger from the wall, I looked up at the ceiling again. The hatch was still open. From where I stood, I could see just the faintest hint of movement. Maybe dust, maybe something shifting in the dark. The drive down the mountain was tense and silent. The snow-covered trees looked endless, the road winding down with no sign of another car. I didn't even feel relief until we reached the first gas station near the highway. Later, when we reported everything to Airbnb, the host's listing disappeared within a day. No more photos, no trace of the cabin online. I never heard back from her after that. I still think about that weekend more often than I'd like. I think about how many times we sat in that living room, talking and laughing, while someone was just a few feet above us, probably listening. I think about the crumbs, the sound of movement, the way the hatch kept opening wider. The idea that someone could be so close, hidden just above your head, changes the way you feel about quiet places. Now, whenever I stay somewhere new, I always look for attic doors, crawl spaces, vents, anything that could hide a person. I don't even book cabins anymore. The thought of being alone in one, surrounded by silence, knowing someone might be right above, unseen, breathing quietly in the dark, is something I can't shake. That cabin taught me something about isolation I never forgot. When you're that far from anyone else, silence doesn't always mean you're alone. Sometimes it just means whoever's there with you is staying perfectly still. I booked the Airbnb because I needed a quiet place to work for a couple of weeks. I was doing remote work at the time and wanted somewhere peaceful, not too expensive, and away from distractions. The listing was for a small apartment in a residential neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom unit with a little kitchen, a small balcony, and decent Wi-Fi. The reviews were positive. People said it was cozy, clean, and perfect for short stays. When I arrived, it looked just like the pictures. The building was older but well kept. The hallway outside smelled faintly of cleaning products, and the apartment door was painted a dull blue. Inside, it was neat. Plain white walls, wooden floors, a couch, a small table by the window. Everything looked simple but comfortable. The air felt a little stale, but I opened the windows and let some light in. There was a short hallway that led to the bathroom and bedroom. Along that hallway, there were 3 doors, one to the bathroom, one to the bedroom, and one that was locked. The locked one caught my attention right away. It had a plain brass knob and a keyhole, but no key anywhere in sight. I figured it was just a supply closet or a utility area. The first couple of days went by quietly. I worked from the kitchen table, cooked my meals, went for walks in the evenings. The neighborhood was calm. A few families, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the sound of cars passing occasionally. It was the kind of place that made you forget other people even existed. The locked door didn't bother me much at first. I passed it a dozen times a day and didn't think twice. But one night, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something faint. A smell. It wasn't strong, just a thin, sour scent, like food that had been left out too long. I figured maybe I'd forgotten to take the trash out or something in the fridge had gone bad. I cleaned everything that night, wiped the counters, emptied the trash, washed the sink. The smell faded after a bit, so I didn't think about it again. The next evening, though, it came back. Stronger this time. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to make the air feel heavy. It reminded me of rotting fruit or meat left out in the heat. I checked the fridge again, pulled the trash can apart, even cleaned the drain. Nothing helped. The smell seemed to hang in the hallway, right near that locked door. I stood there for a while, just staring at the door, wondering what was behind it. It didn't make sense that a smell that strong could come from a storage closet, unless something inside had spoiled. I put my ear against it, listening. There was no sound, just a faint hum from somewhere deep in the building. Over the next few days, it got worse. Every night, the smell grew thicker, more sour. It seeped into the bedroom even with the door closed. I started feeling uneasy, imagining what could be inside. Maybe a dead rat, maybe mold, maybe old food the host forgot about. But there was something else about it that bothered me. It wasn't just the smell. It was the feeling that the air near that door felt warmer, like there was something alive behind it once, something that didn't belong there. I messaged the host and asked again about the door. He said it was storage, just cleaning supplies, he told me. I tried to let it go, but that night I barely slept. Every time I turned over, I caught a faint whiff of that stench drifting down the hallway, thick and sour. By the 5th night, I couldn't take it anymore. The smell was unbearable. It was strongest right outside the locked door, almost like it was leaking through the edges. The thought of sleeping another night with it made my stomach turn. I decided to open it. I didn't have any tools, so I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, one with a thin blade, and tried to wedge it into the space between the door and the frame. The metal scraped softly, and after a few minutes of pushing, the latch gave a little. The door creaked as it opened, just an inch at first, then wider. The smell hit me hard, thick, stale, almost sweet. I covered my nose with my sleeve and turned on the flashlight from my phone. Inside, it wasn't a storage closet at all. It was small, barely big enough for a person to lie down in. The floor was covered with an old blanket and a half-empty sleeping bag. There was a small pile of clothes in the corner. A jacket, a pair of jeans, socks, all dirty and crumpled. Beside them sat a little plastic cooler with the lid open. Inside were a few things: an empty water bottle, a moldy sandwich wrapped in foil, and a cracked container that looked like it once held leftovers. There were food crumbs on the floor, a torn magazine, and a single shoe lying near the wall. The air inside was thick and humid, the smell of rotting food and sweat clinging to everything. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I realized what I was looking at. Someone had been living in there, sleeping in that tiny space, eating in it, existing in silence just a few feet from where I'd been working and sleeping. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The sleeping bag was still rolled slightly open, like someone had just climbed out of it. There were footprints, faint, dusty marks leading to the back corner of the closet. I looked closer and saw an indentation near the wall where something heavy had sat recently. It looked like the person had left in a hurry. I backed out slowly, shut the door halfway, and stood there shaking. The apartment felt different suddenly. Too quiet, too still. Every creak made me tense up. I packed my things that night. I didn't even think about sleeping there again. I shoved my clothes into my suitcase, grabbed my laptop, and left. When I stepped out into the cold night air, it felt like I could finally breathe again. The hallway outside was dim, the old bulbs buzzing faintly. I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked out, half expecting to hear footsteps behind me. The next morning, after checking into a hotel, I called Airbnb and told them everything. They said they'd contact the host and investigate. Later, I got a short message saying the listing had been removed and the host's account suspended. That was it. No explanation, no details about who had been staying there before me. I still think about that smell sometimes. The slow way it crept through the air each night, the sense that something wasn't right from the start. The part that sticks with me most is how lived in that little space looked. Whoever had been there wasn't just squatting for a night. They'd been staying there for a while, maybe coming and going between guests. The clothes, the food, the sleeping bag, all of it pointed to someone trying to survive in secret. I've stayed in plenty of Airbnbs since then, but I can't relax the same way anymore. Every time I walk into a new place, I look for locked doors, vents, hidden corners. I check closets, open every cabinet, make sure there's no space someone could crawl into. That apartment made me realize how little we actually know about the places we stay in. You can walk into a room, turn on the lights, and think you're alone, but you never really know who might have been there before you, or who might be planning to come back once the lights go out again. It was early spring when a few of my close friends and I decided to take a short weekend trip together. We'd all been exhausted from work and needed a break. Just 2 nights somewhere quiet, surrounded by trees and fresh air. One of my friends found a small cabin on Airbnb that looked perfect. It wasn't too far out of town, about a 2-hour drive, and the pictures showed a rustic place with a small porch, a fire pit, and a big kitchen where we could cook together. The host's profile seemed fine, a middle-aged woman with good reviews. The price was low compared to others in the area, which made it even more appealing. When we arrived that Friday evening, the air was cool, and the sun had just started dipping behind the treeline. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by tall pines. There were no other houses visible nearby, only forest in every direction. It was peaceful in a way that city life never was. The host met us when we pulled in. She looked friendly enough, maybe in her 50s, wearing an oversized sweater and thick glasses. She handed over the keys, showed us around briefly, and then left, saying she lived a few miles down the road if we needed anything. The cabin itself was small but cozy. A wooden living room with an old couch and a fireplace, a kitchen that smelled faintly of pine cleaner, and 2 small bedrooms. There were 4 of us, so 2 people shared each room. The floors creaked when we walked, and the walls had a faint chill to them that no heater could quite push out, but it was comfortable enough. We unpacked, started dinner, played some music, and spent the night laughing around the fire pit with a few drinks. The forest around us was silent, and the stars looked clearer than I'd seen in years. That first night was uneventful. Everyone went to bed sometime after midnight, and I remember falling asleep easily to the sound of wind through the trees. The next day, we woke up late and made breakfast together. We spent most of the afternoon hiking a nearby trail the host had mentioned in her welcome note. When we got back to the cabin, the sun was setting behind the forest, and the light through the trees had that dim orange glow that makes everything look calm. We cooked dinner again, played cards, and by around 11, everyone started heading to their rooms. It must have been an hour or so later when I woke up. I wasn't sure why, maybe a sound or maybe just the quietness itself. The cabin had that heavy kind of silence that makes your ears strain to find any noise. My first thought was that one of my friends had gotten up to use the bathroom or grab a drink from the kitchen. I rolled over, pulled the blanket up, and was about to drift off again when I heard it, the sound of the front door opening softly. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A slow, creaking noise, followed by a faint thud as it closed. I froze for a second, staring at the dark ceiling. The air felt colder suddenly. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone had gone outside for air. But then I remembered we'd locked the door before bed. I listened hard. There were soft footsteps, slow, steady ones, moving across the wooden floor toward the kitchen. I sat up quietly, trying not to make any sound. My roommate was asleep on the other side of the bed, breathing evenly. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence returned, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Then I heard the faint scrape of something metal, maybe a chair leg, against the kitchen floor. That was enough to push away any thought of sleep. I got up carefully and went to the door. My phone was on the nightstand, but there was barely any service in this area, so calling anyone wasn't an option. I eased the door open and stepped into the narrow hallway. The kitchen light was off, but there was just enough moonlight coming through the window to make out the shape of the counter and the outlines of the table. The front door was slightly open, not wide, just enough to see the edge of the doormat. I walked closer and saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were wet, muddy footprints on the floor, leading from the door into the kitchen area. They were fresh, smeared, as if someone had come in recently. I backed away, went to wake the others quietly. Within a minute, we were all up, standing in the hallway, looking toward the kitchen. Everyone looked half asleep and confused, but the footprints snapped them awake fast. We searched the cabin top to bottom, every corner, every room, even outside with flashlights. But there was no one, no sound of anyone running off, no lights in the woods, nothing but the cold and the wind through the trees. We made sure the door was locked again and pushed a chair against it for good measure. No one slept much that night. Every small sound made us flinch. The next morning, the footprints were still there. They looked different in daylight, more defined. You could see the tread marks clearly, like from a pair of boots. The door frame had a small smear of mud too, like someone had brushed against it with their hand. We tried to laugh it off over breakfast, blaming a drunk hiker or some local kid messing around, but no one really believed that. We had all heard that door. Still, it was our last day, and we didn't want to overreact. We figured we'd leave after lunch and just get home early. When the host came by later that morning to check on things, we mentioned it casually, trying to sound less shaken than we felt. She didn't seem alarmed at first, but when we described the footprints, she frowned slightly. She looked away for a second before saying something that made my stomach drop. She told us that her ex-boyfriend had lived there with her years ago before she turned it into a rental. He had been having a hard time letting go, and she suspected he still had a set of keys somewhere. She changed the locks a few times, but he always seemed to find his way in again, even once when other guests were staying. The way she said it, calm, almost resigned, made it worse, like it wasn't the first time it had happened, and she'd just grown used to it. We left soon after that. None of us said much during the drive home. I remember staring out the window as the forest thinned and the road widened, trying not to think about how close someone had been that night. The thought of someone quietly opening the door while we were all asleep, standing there just watching, left a feeling I couldn't shake for weeks. When I looked back at the Airbnb listing later that evening, it had already been taken down. The host's profile was gone too. Maybe she finally reported it, or maybe she just didn't want anyone asking more questions. I still think about that moment when I first heard the door open. How quiet it was, how slow. It wasn't rushed or clumsy, like a mistake. Whoever it was, they had done it before. And that's the worst part. Realizing that sometimes the scariest thing about being alone in a quiet place isn't what you imagine might be out there in the woods. It's the fact that someone could already be inside, moving through the same space as you, quiet enough that you'd never know until it was too late. I booked the place because it was cheap. That was the only real reason. I was traveling through a few small towns for work, trying to keep my expenses low, and the listing looked fine enough. It was advertised as a private basement suite with a small kitchenette, a private entrance, and quiet atmosphere. The pictures showed clean walls, a bed, a small TV, and a narrow window letting in a little light. The reviews were mixed. Some said it was fine for a short stay, others mentioned a damp smell, but I figured for one night it would be good enough. When I arrived, the house looked normal. It sat on a quiet street lined with tall trees and small driveways. The main house was a dull beige color with an old porch and a few potted plants that looked like they hadn't been watered in weeks. The host came to the door after a long pause. He looked to be in his late 40s with messy hair and heavy eyes, wearing a sweatshirt with the sleeves pushed up. He said very little. He didn't really smile, didn't make eye contact. He just pointed to the side of the house where the basement entrance was and handed me the keys. Something about him felt off. Not aggressive or rude, just withdrawn, like he didn't want to be seen. The basement door was around the back of the house, a short flight of concrete steps leading down to it. The smell hit me the second I opened the door. A thick, musty odor of old wood, dust, and damp concrete. The air felt heavy. Inside, the basement was small, maybe the size of a single-bedroom apartment. The floor was covered with thin carpet, the kind that feels slightly sticky under your shoes. The walls were painted a yellowish white, with water stains showing through in a few spots. There was a small bed tucked against the wall, a dresser beside it, and a kitchenette area with a sink, mini fridge, and a microwave. The ceiling was low, and the only window was a narrow rectangle near the top of the wall, barely large enough to fit your arm through. The light coming in was faint, tinted gray from the cloudy sky. I put my bag down and sat on the bed. The springs creaked loudly under my weight. The whole place was quiet, too quiet, with that muffled kind of silence that basements have, the kind where even your breathing sounds too loud. I could hear faint creaks from the floor above, probably from the host moving around. Every few minutes, something in the pipes clicked. After a while, I started to settle in. I'd been driving all day, so I showered in the small bathroom, ate a sandwich I'd brought with me, and spent the evening on my laptop. I didn't see the host again after check-in. I could hear footsteps occasionally upstairs, slow and steady, like someone pacing, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just tired, and the house was old. When I went to bed, it was almost midnight. The room felt colder at night. I turned off the lights, but the faint glow from that little window barely lit the wall. The air smelled faintly like mold and something else I couldn't place, maybe stale food. I pulled the blanket up and tried to sleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The room was pitch dark, and everything was silent. I lay there for a few seconds trying to adjust my eyes. Then I heard it. Faint, soft sounds like something brushing or scraping against the wall. It was steady, not random, and it was coming from somewhere behind the dresser. My first thought was that it was pipes, maybe air moving through the walls. But it didn't sound mechanical. It sounded slow, irregular, almost like cautious footsteps, except too close, like they were inside the walls. The sound would stop for a few seconds, then start again, shifting slightly, like something was moving around. I sat up and listened harder. My heartbeat picked up. The sound continued, muffled, as if something was brushing along the inside of the wall. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The bright beam cut through the dark and landed on the dresser. The sound stopped instantly. The room felt frozen. I stared at the wall, waiting for something else, but everything stayed still. I stood up quietly, moving closer, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The wall behind the dresser looked normal from a distance, but as I got closer, I noticed a small wooden panel at the bottom, about a foot wide, with the edge slightly pulled away from the wall. It wasn't flush like the rest. It looked like someone had opened it recently and didn't close it all the way. The air near it felt colder, and there was a faint smell coming from it. Something sour, like old food or dirty clothes. I pushed the dresser aside slowly. The carpet underneath was darker, probably from moisture. I crouched down, put the light on the panel, and saw a small opening behind it. Not large, just enough space for a person to crawl through. Inside, the beam of light caught a few things right away. Crumpled food wrappers, a half-empty water bottle, and an old, dirty blanket shoved against the far end. The space extended back several feet, maybe connecting to another part of the basement wall. The air inside looked thick with dust. It took a few seconds for the realization to hit me fully. Someone had been staying in there, not long ago either. The wrappers didn't look old, and the blanket was positioned like someone had been using it as bedding. I backed away slowly, keeping the light trained on the opening. My throat felt dry. The first thought that hit me was that maybe the host didn't know. Maybe some vagrant or squatter had found a way into the walls. But then I remembered how odd the host had been, how quiet he was, how he never looked at me. It made me wonder if he knew exactly what was down there. I grabbed my bag and started packing whatever I could as quickly as possible. The room felt tighter, like the walls were closing in. Every small noise made me stop and listen. I kept glancing at the hole, half expecting something to move inside it. Before I left, I took one last look at the crawl space. The light caught something faint, a small piece of cloth wedged deeper in, maybe part of another blanket or clothing. I didn't stay to find out. I got into my car and left right then, still in my night clothes. The street was dead quiet, and the house looked just as still as before, but it felt completely different now. I drove until I found an all-night diner by the highway and sat there for an hour, just trying to shake off the feeling that I'd been watched the whole time. The next morning, I called Airbnb support and reported the listing. I sent photos of the crawl space, the wrappers, the blanket. They said they'd investigate, and a few days later, the listing disappeared. I didn't hear anything more about it for a while, but eventually, I saw a local news article online. Apparently, police had searched the house after multiple complaints. They found evidence that someone had been living in the walls and crawl spaces, not just in the basement, but also in parts of the attic. The host claimed he didn't know, but the police believed he had been letting someone stay there secretly, maybe a relative or a drifter, to avoid paying rent or for reasons nobody fully explained. They found signs of entry tunnels that led between wall cavities, with bedding and trash hidden inside. Whoever had been living there had easy access to the basement through that panel behind the dresser. That part stuck with me, how close they must have been. When I think back to those footsteps, I realize they weren't on the other side of the wall, not really. They were right there, inches away, moving in that narrow space where the sound could carry through the wood and insulation. Now, every time I book a place to stay, especially when it's cheap or described as private, I check everything. Behind furniture, under beds, inside vents. I always look for signs that someone's been there before me in a way they shouldn't have been. That basement felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. The smell, the stillness, the silence. I just didn't want to believe that feeling. If I had stayed one more night, If I hadn't woken up when I did, I don't know what would have happened. Maybe nothing, maybe worse. But I can't forget the sound of those slow, careful footsteps inside the walls, or the sight of that small open panel, hiding just enough to make you think you're alone when you're not. It was supposed to be an easy weekend, just me and my girlfriend, 2 nights away from work, away from noise, away from the city. We picked a small beach town that looked peaceful, a place where the only sounds were supposed to be waves and seagulls. I found a cozy Airbnb that looked perfect in the pictures. Modern, bright, and close to the shore. The reviews were all glowing. People said the host was friendly, the place was spotless, and it looked exactly like the photos. When we arrived that Friday evening, everything seemed perfect. The air smelled like salt and sunscreen, and the sound of the ocean carried faintly from down the street. The Airbnb sat on a quiet lane, tucked between pastel-colored beach houses. The front porch had a small swing, and the inside looked even better than the listing. White walls, soft lighting, clean sheets, a big bed, and a TV mounted neatly on the wall across from it. The bathroom was small but modern, with folded towels and a note from the host welcoming us. It all felt calm and simple, just what we needed. The first night passed easily. We ate dinner in town, walked along the shore under the orange glow of streetlights, and came back to lie in bed watching movies. The place was so quiet that every small sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, the faint rush of the wind through the window, felt amplified. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It just felt like the kind of silence you only get in small towns by the water. The second day went smoothly too. We slept in late, made breakfast, and spent most of the afternoon on the beach. The sand was warm, and hardly anyone else was around. By evening, we were both sunburned and tired. We grabbed takeout, showered, and got into bed again. That's when I noticed her staring at the wall. First, I didn't think much of it. The room was dim except for the glow of the TV and the faint light from outside slipping through the curtains. She was looking at something near the TV, a small dot of light that glowed faint blue. It was right beneath the screen, no bigger than a pen tip. It wasn't blinking or moving, just sitting there quietly. It looked harmless. Probably some little electronic device, a Wi-Fi router, maybe a receiver for the remote, something like that. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless the lights were low. But then we realized something. The Wi-Fi router was already plugged in across the room, sitting on a small desk by the corner. It had its own green and white lights blinking. That blue one, though, stayed steady. It didn't belong to anything else visible. Curiosity turned into a slow kind of unease. I unplugged the router completely, thinking maybe that blue light was somehow connected. But it stayed there, still glowing faintly, a small fixed dot right beneath the TV, aimed directly toward the bed. Something about the position of it made my stomach turn. It was angled perfectly, centered with the bed like it had been placed to capture everything. I got up and leaned closer. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It wasn't just a light. It was a lens, tiny, round, and cold-looking, buried in a small hole drilled into the wall behind a dark glass cover. That moment stretched out. The room that had felt safe suddenly felt like a trap. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, unnatural, like the air itself was watching us. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I looked around the room again, scanning every corner, the vents, the smoke detector, even the picture frame above the dresser. My mind started racing. How many of these could there be? How long had they been recording? How many people had stayed here before? We didn't waste any more time. We threw everything into our bags, not even folding clothes, not even checking drawers. The place suddenly felt smaller, darker, and more invasive with every second. The more I looked, the more I imagined those small blue lights blinking in other rooms, hidden behind the air vents or the mirrors. When we stepped outside, the night air felt thick. The quiet street that had seemed peaceful earlier now felt empty and strange. The other houses were dark. The ocean sounded distant, muffled. We walked fast to the car, locked the doors, and drove off without saying anything. The whole way out of that town, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing by the Airbnb porch watching us go. We stopped at a gas station a few towns away. The fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of the pumps felt grounding, like a return to normal life. I remember sitting there, trying to calm down, but the image of that small blue light kept flashing in my head. It wasn't bright or loud, just steady and watching. We booked another place last minute, a cheap motel by the highway. It didn't matter that it smelled faintly like smoke or that the sheets were old. It was just a place where we could lock the door and know exactly who was inside. But even then, I found myself scanning every corner, looking for any kind of hidden light. I checked the smoke alarm, the vents, behind the TV, under the lamp. I didn't sleep much that night. Every small sound made me sit up and listen. When we got home, I reported the listing to Airbnb. I didn't know what to expect. Maybe nothing, maybe a refund. But the next day, I got an email saying the host's account had been removed and the listing was under investigation. That's when it became real. A week later, news articles started showing up. It turned out the host had been installing hidden cameras in multiple properties he managed, not just ours. They were found in bedrooms, bathrooms, even living rooms, tiny devices built into walls, light fixtures, smoke detectors. He'd been doing it for months, maybe years, quietly watching strangers come and go. The police had seized his computers and found recordings of dozens of guests. People from all over, couples, families, solo travelers, all unknowingly filmed. Reading about it made my stomach twist. I kept thinking back to that small blue light, how harmless it had looked at first. It made me realize how easy it is for someone to invade your life without you knowing. How simple it is for privacy to disappear in places that feel safe. I thought about how many nights we had stayed there, how we had laughed and relaxed, completely unaware. All those moments that were supposed to be private, moments that belonged to us, had probably been captured and stored somewhere by someone we'd never met. Even now, whenever I stay somewhere new, I can't stop myself from checking. I scan every wall, every outlet, every light. I keep my phone flashlight on longer than I need to, shining it into corners, under shelves, behind TVs. Sometimes I catch reflections in the glass and feel my stomach clench until I realize it's nothing. But I can never shake that feeling entirely. That small blue light changed something in me. It taught me how fragile privacy really is, how easily it can be taken by someone who knows exactly where to hide a tiny lens. We never went back to that beach town. Every time I see photos of it online, it feels tainted. The sand, the waves, the pastel houses. It all looks calm and perfect, just like it did that weekend. But behind that calm, I know what was really there. Quiet cameras waiting for the next couple to arrive, to laugh, to sleep, to think they were alone. What scares me the most is thinking about all the others who never noticed. All the people who stayed there before us and never saw that little blue light. All the nights recorded, stored somewhere on a hard drive, maybe still sitting on a shelf or in a cloud folder. Their lives frozen in frames they'll never know exist. That's what sticks with me. The thought that if she hadn't noticed it that night, if we'd just gone to sleep, we'd be part of that unseen collection too. Just two more faces caught in the glow of that quiet blue light.